Hello from Lourdes University Grey Wolves. I'm Chelsea.
And I'm Nick, and thanks for joining us today.
College students across the country, including us, have had a turbulent school year between the regular academic struggles of college, the recent protests for racial awareness, and, most obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. All of these big factors contribute to not only difficulty in college studies, but also with mental health. The pandemic has had a long-lasting effect on those who struggle with mental health issues. Dealing with physical health symptoms on top of mental health has been a struggle for each and every one of us. However, with rising mental health issues comes hope to crush the negative stigma surrounding these issues, and may even help us understand emotions and problems we previously couldn't.
2020 was a difficult year for everyone, from the wildfires in California to the death of George Floyd. It was hard to feel optimistic. By far, the most challenging issue was the spread of COVID-19. This virus sparked a global pandemic that was enough to shut down America's economy and workforce. Not only were thousands catching the virus, many others started to suffer with their own health issues that stemmed from the isolation of quarantining. Today, America is still recovering from the lasting physical and mental impacts of COVID-19. Although we will not return to a new normal for quite some time, there are ways to cope with the lasting effects from the pandemic. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did a study displaying the percentage of Americans experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety after living through the nightmare of a pandemic. From the months of January to June of 2019, 11% of U.S. adults claimed to have symptoms of anxiety and/or depression. By December 2020, 42% of U.S. adults reported symptoms of anxiety and/or depression. This is a drastic increase because that 11% nearly tripled with a 31% increase in the matter of 6 to 12 months. COVID-19 not only led to a physical health crisis, but also a mental health crisis. Even though many of us are doing our part in staying away from others, it has not been easy. Going from having an active and social lifestyle, whether that be at school or at a job, to a lifestyle of only leaving out of necessity has been difficult. Communication has transformed from being both online and in person to almost exclusively online. Despite how adept we are at talking online to millions of people, it is another reminder that while we can chat with someone across the world, we are still alone at home. The CDC article lists simple ways to cope with that loneliness. Focus on keeping your body healthy, continue to talk to everyone you can at home or online, engage in hobbies, and avoid too much consumption of the news online, on TV, or in the papers. It is interesting that the CDC recommends that those struggling with mental health to step away from the news, but this is supported by other articles as well. The National Institute of Mental Health also reiterates this point through an infographic. They state, "Take breaks from the news and focus on the facts." The amount of misinformation spread about COVID-19 and the constant coverage about it on the news may contribute to stress and anxiety in some people.
One of the most common myths, honestly, is that, and issues I've seen in the student population, is that I've already had COVID, so I don't need to go and get the vaccine. So unfortunately, we don't know enough about COVID to substantiate that that won't be an issue. Because just like any other viruses, and this is considered as one of the adenoviruses and similar to the flu, it's constantly evolving. And so it's potentially possible that it's already mutated multiple times and there's different strains out there. And so the current vaccine, ergo maybe in the future, a year from now, if this is still our life, might actually have to have more strains in it, just like the flu shot does. And so it is necessary to get the COVID vaccine for protective purposes. But the other component that's a myth is that if I've already had COVID, I won't get it again. Another issue is, like I had mentioned, with the strains, that can't be possibly true, 100% at least. And then as far as other myths go, some of the more common ones, especially with women's health, is that they are concerned that if they have COVID, even during the early stages of pregnancy, that it will cause pregnancy issues. or eventually cause demise of their child in utero. And so far, research hasn't shown that actually has caused any issues. And honestly, there's been recent research that shows that increased estrogen levels have actually been a protective factor. And women that are having menses actually might be more protected from the dire effects of COVID. To the point where they're actually even doing research right now and giving estrogen, like hormone therapy, to men to see if it will help, significantly decrease their signs and symptoms and their mortality, because men are unfortunately more likely to die from COVID.
I work with people that are willing to come in and talk with me or talk with all of our counselors. So that's a significant, that's a good piece of information. Those folks are engaged and they're willing to come in and or we provide Zoom teletherapy also. So they're engaged. Those folks we stay in contact with. It's people that are afraid to leave the house or have a concern that there's still a stigma with mental health. So my counsel would be, please reach out to someone. Certainly to a medical doctor can help if you're concerned about going to see a counselor. And the medical doctor can say, maybe it's a good idea for you to see a counselor, which, by the way, we've seen an increase in doctors sending people, saying, really, there's nothing else I can do, but you might want to talk to someone. So my counsel is always reach out to a friend, a family member that you trust, and make sure that if you're at a place where you feel like you're really reaching crisis, that you contact someone in the community that can help. Naturally, friends and family, if you have a good support system, that's going to help. So that's the main thing, is to reach out. And then to also, if you know about social media, there's a way to sort of go in and grab the most recent kinds of tools that can help with therapy, something like deep breathing, something like listening to your favorite song. How about going for a walk? So there's ways that people can start feeling better, but the main thing is to get connected, somehow get connected to someone so you can speak what you need, and then someone can help guide you to counseling.
Although coping mechanisms are helpful and/or essential to many who struggle with mental health problems, it is important to note that it does not replace medical treatment from a professional. It is important to reach out to a mental health professional, such as a doctor or therapist, when struggling with mental health symptoms or having suicidal thoughts. There are many treatments available. When you speak to a professional, they will be able to find the best option for each individual person. Dr. Fasharaki Zada, a Yale Medicine neuropsychiatrist, states that it is important to address emotions that could be mental health related, or it could lead to a potential long-term problem such as post-traumatic stress disorder. If you are having thoughts of harming yourself, do not hesitate to reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is an organization that provides free and confidential emotional support to people in suicidal crisis or emotional distress, 24 hours a day and 7 days a week.
Many people are struggling with coping with mental health. With many people not knowing how to handle feelings they haven't experienced and the anxieties that come with it, tensions are rising in many aspects of daily life. This resulted in the projection of tensions and negative emotion onto different societal issues. An issue hit hardest with the emotion has been the struggle with race. Racial protests dominate across the country every couple of years when a civil injustice happens so severe it awakens even the most drowsy of people. This summer's infamous Black Lives Matter movement spread not only to all 50 states, but also all over the world.
On the COVID side of things, you have the vaccine that's out now, but you have a resistance still to the belief in COVID, and so people are hesitant to take the vaccine. And then with the racial injustice, we're just now getting to the trial of the officer in George Floyd's death. So Right now, that's not resolved. It's who knows what's going to happen with that trial. Hopefully, it's a outcome that is justified. Then I think that will be resolved. That incident will be resolved. Now, racial injustice, as far as policing and all that, that's going to take some time. You have different two thoughts. You know, whether it's defund the police, or you have police reform, or I should say three sides of the coin. So you have defund the police, police reform, or do nothing, leave it the way it is now.
On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was murdered, and the entire world felt his pain. Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin had knelt on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes straight. This civil injustice was the match that lit the fire for this summer's 2020 series of racial protests. The first of these protests took place in Minneapolis, where Floyd had died. Eventually, George Floyd's death sparked protests in all 50 states as well as all over the world. Floyd's death marked on many times black men had died at the hands of white police officers. Even with great showing of support across the globe, there was a considerable amount of backlash. In the days after Floyd's death, amidst growing agitation and protest, former President Donald Trump gave several different press briefings. In doing so, he gave his condolences, as expected. But on his Twitter feed, he insulted civil rights activists and diminished their work. One tweet claimed that not one DC Black Lives Matter protest came close to the White House. Otherwise, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs, the most ominous weapons I have ever seen. That's when people would have been badly hurt, at least mainly Secret Service agents just waiting for action. We put the young ones on the front line, sir. They love it. This tweet was followed by another racially charged tweet. These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to the governor, Tim Walz, and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you. The phrase that gathered the most attention when the looting starts, was popularized by Police Chief Walter Headley when he said it, referring to the protests that took place during the 1960s civil rights movement. Days after publishing these tweets, former President Trump hosted a conference call with all 50 governors. During the call, Trump said of the protests that they were taking place in the summer 2020, "It's a movement. If you don't put it down, it will get worse and worse. The only time it's successful is when you're weak, and most of you are weak." Trump's reference was to the Black Lives Matter movement, which had gained traction since the people began recording incidents where black men were treated violently and sometimes died at the hands of white police officers. Trump was calling for the end of this movement without recognizing the reason that the movement had started in the first place. It seemed he was out of touch with the reality of black lives in America, and did not recognize the need for change. The black lives came from other places as well, other than former President Trump. As well, in the background or the foreground, wherever you choose to look at it, we are in the middle of a global pandemic. To mitigate spread of the virus, we were asked to wear masks, and many businesses were either closed or only allowed for outdoor events. Even though the protests took place outside, the sheer number of people in one location, sometimes over 1,000, seemed a dangerous position to put these people's lives in. These protests may or may not have been raised the COVID numbers, but they did raise awareness to the problems of America. These Black Lives Matter protests have served to highlight the mistreatment of Black Americans and the need for change. Unfortunately, America has had a very thick racial tension in the air.
I think COVID, the racial injustice, the current political climate has done a number on people, and I think it's been positive in some aspects where it's changed that covert racism into overt racism. We see it now for sure. Some people still deny it, but for the most part, we all know it's there. I think it's brought certain groups of people closer together because they've had a rallying point, something to get behind. For others, especially I hear of families who are on two separate sides of the political spectrum that have been torn apart, where they don't even talk to each other. And I think some people use COVID as an excuse. Well, I can't go over there anyway because of COVID. But regardless, I think that it has done both. I think that it's kind of fractured some people, and then it's kind of brought people closer together. If I had to choose one, I would say it probably fractured more people than it's brought together, though.
Hopefully, the protests that took place during the summer have highlighted the need for further change in America.
My job has been tasked with increasing the numbers and the diversity that we see in our faculty and staff. So students want to see themselves or people who look like them in the classroom. That's been a big mission that our president has tasked me with. And that's a big job to do. And it's not just up to me, though. It is up to the campus, the Lourdes community as a whole, to take part in that process, and even for students. So we can have programs and we can have training, which we're doing. We're having programs, we're having training, and right now, as I said, our committee, I'm the chair of our DEI committee. We are focusing mainly on faculty and staff professional development. That will hopefully transition to students when we move into the fall. We're going to have additional programming. So programming is good, professional development is great, but people do need to understand that it's not just on me to make these things happen. I can maybe able to, from an HR standpoint, bring people here, but what are we doing? What are you doing? What is Professor so-and-so, what is that staff member doing to make that person feel included, to feel heard, and to feel safe here, to where they can come here and they want to actually stay. And they feel included, they feel a part of the community that we, as Franciscans all preach about. So I think programming and professional development is one way to get there, but taking those action steps beyond taking those action steps at what we learn in those programming and what we learn in the professional development and actually putting that to use. So this past year, it was kind of a trial run for our committee, putting on programming and putting on professional development. We touched on topics from, mostly we focused on race, implicit bias, and we even did some LGBTQ topics. Issues, and we're going to actually start a social identity series upcoming for the next 2 academic years, where we'll focus on 4, we call it the Big 8, and we'll focus on 4 in the academic 21-22, and then 22 and 23 we'll concentrate on other 4. And then we'll also do programming in between. So we're trying to increase people's knowledge and awareness, and then from that point actually take that knowledge and put it to action.
With COVID bringing awareness and educating the public to a subject so sensitive like race, it also gave its fair share of struggles to education as well.
When we first heard about the pandemic as college students, one of the first concerns that came to our mind was how classes were going to continue and how this was going to impact our education. The thought of COVID at first, we felt that nothing could go wrong during our classes, but we were so wrong in the end. COVID has impacted our education strongly and has still to this day. Many students wondering how they will deal with online classes and not being used to it. This is how we are going to deal with our classes during COVID. When severe cases of the COVID-19 virus forced families across the globe to restrict their physical socialization and remain indoors, schools had to drastically and immediately transition to a COVID-safe learning environment. This transition required the use of tools such as Zoom, Google Classroom, and Microsoft Teams. By fall 2020, some schools provided hybrid learning environments, which was accomplished by sending half of a school's student population to the physical campus every other day or class period, and meeting as a class on an online platform the other days of the week.
You know, I think I was and we were prepared as anybody else when this happened. You know, I can't say enough about our faculty here in terms of being able to pivot on a dime, our students being able to adjust, staff, student support, residence life, our whole community team being able to adjust to something on the fly. And we did this in a few days span. It was quick, it happened. You know, we were, reactionary in some ways, but also we, were being proactive as we went through the last year, and we've changed things. I mean, our goal was let's safely get to the end of the semester, and then now it's like, okay, how do we safely open in the fall? And here we are, middle of April, moving into getting closer to May. And, I teach a class on Mondays, and, one of the things I said, we only have a couple more weeks left. And a couple of the students said it's like hard to believe that we're already here. I think with online or hybrid, you have a little more flexibility in terms of learning, in terms of looking beyond maybe a brick and mortar or a classroom. You have that ability to move. Not saying you don't in a traditional kind of face-to-face class, but I think with online hybrid, you have that ability to be out and about and creatively bring in others that may not be able to come traditionally into a classroom. I know I've talked with many of our faculty this past year, bringing in some speakers that normally we want to be able to have come here due to travel, but through Zoom, it's like they're right there with the group. So that was an exciting piece, I think, of one of the benefits that we saw.
Virtual and hybrid learning experiences worked well for some students and not so well for others. COVID has impacted students in many ways, but mostly because of not being able to go to school. The COVID-19 pandemic may worsen existing mental health problems and lead to more cases among children and adolescents because of the unique combination of the public health crisis, social isolation, and economic recession. Write the authors of a study conducted to gauge the mental and emotional health of grade school students at Utopia. COVID has brought many issues to students. It has made them feel depressed, sad, and lonely, and many students have lacked the motivation to do their schoolwork. This has been the case with college students as well. I know that I have felt all these things due to the pandemic. Missing my community college graduation was particularly difficult, and it has been hard to be away from friends.
I think we crave socialization, and if you look back, and I often think about that week in March when it's hard to believe it's been over a year ago now, but I think about that week in March when we made that first shift in learning. But for me, it really is, we are at a place that values community, values that interaction, and I think we continue to have our faculty, students, staff, and our community members hungry for that. And I know we're getting bits and pieces of that back, but doing it safely and cautiously. And I think as we continue to grow and adjust, we're going to see, I think, more creativeness with hybrid delivery, online delivery, face-to-face, traditional face-to-face delivery, in terms of how do we capture that socialization.
One of the issues with online learning is adapting to it. Not all students have taken an online class before.
Education shouldn't depend on your zip code, of what kind of education you get. That's obsolete, and I think we need to change the way we think. Do I think it changes the way we do education? I hope it does, because there's so many great things that came out of this. I know I think right now you have a student joining your class digitally. Well, think about how that changes just a student that gets sick, right? But we've all been there, you're sick, they won't let you come to school, but you can still be in school. Think about how that keeps you learning in spots where you might be sent away, right? If you have a fever, you can't come to school anymore, right? But now you can keep learning. I also think the ability to connect with teachers is phenomenal. That consistent access. I know many schools have gone to, they call them now office hours in K-12 buildings, where for 30 minutes, parents can jump on and ask a teacher a question. that's invaluable, right? Engaging the community and making them, opening up schools, because parents are more supportive of schools if they know what's going on. Students of special needs, I think, have been left behind a bit. As a parent of a student with special needs, I've noticed that immediately. Just many online systems are set up where there's a set of things they have to do, right? Well, my son struggles to handle more than one instruction at a time. So if you give him 10 things he has to do in a day, he's still stuck on number one. He's so overwhelmed with the other 9 that he can't begin. So I think students with special needs and students in IEPs, there needs to be care given to that and how the online systems should work for them.
I think COVID sped some things up, but it also has allowed us to be really creative and allowed some new energy to flow into, higher education. It's also one of the things I'll speak to. It's also allowed our accreditors to kind of rethink their outlines and outcomes that they expect from institutions. And that's refreshing in some ways, because traditionally it was this way and then you have this outcome and do that. And we're still changing and we're still growing. And I think, in looking at, courses that you've taken, in the last year, that's a piece of, as you reflect back and then you reflect back to prior to COVID, how do you compare? And I think when you look at the comparison and we go forward, it really is about that investment, that connection with the faculty member, that connection with your classmates that makes this all work.
It's increased access to museums around the world and how many things you can now get access to that were just shut off you had to go visit. So now people of poverty or people who can't travel to these places now have access to museums and can get in there and see them. And think about how exciting it is. You could go to a country now and walk around digitally and see the sites without actually being there and hear what's going on, or walk in a museum and see the exhibits without being there. Think about the field trips you went on as a kid that might have changed you. Want to be a scientist because you experienced something, or wanting to go, like for me, I was an English major that's what I was, and for me to experience a play where now you can actually see a play and you don't have to always be there and experience the things. I know it's not the same thing, but it's better than the alternative, which is nothing. So I think it's opened up opportunities for people to be educated, and the arts can now be more accessible to all, and that excites me.
Unfortunately, that technology that schools provide is often inadequate. Laptops have issues, and the internet connection is not always stable. This makes for difficulties following along with lessons and can be very frustrating. That the school gives usually always have issues, which are frustrating to deal with. As one teacher reported in a USA Today article, about a third of his students experience an outage that cuts into their online learning time. Nearly all of his students are from low-income families, and many can't afford wired broadband service. The system goes down, or someone is working on a tower, or there's too many people on the Wi-Fi hotspot. It cuts out, Lozano explains in USA Today.
With COVID bringing many new challenges to education online especially, media has had its many shares of problems due to COVID. Media has played a huge role for students in keeping them informed about the pandemic and how their lives are going to be. An area that has been hit the hardest by the pandemic is media. Different forms of media, such as social media and news media, were swamped with stories and reports about the physical impact of COVID. Throughout the pandemic, these sources have struggled with the amount of information received. How does this impact us and how we perceive these news outlets?
One of the primary ways we receive information is through the media. The pandemic has shown how essential accurate news media coverage is. Whether it is through newspapers, websites, or local cable, most people have access to news about the pandemic. However, the internet, and especially social media, has opened the door to an array of misinformation and disinformation. Thus, it is vital for the media to convey accurate information. COVID has impacted the way we view the news. Many people are experiencing stress, anxiety, and uncertainty about the future. This is why accurate news coverage of the pandemic is so important. In the midst of the pandemic, the Pew Research Center did a variety of different studies regarding Americans' views on the COVID outbreak and how it impacted their trust in the news and in journalists. The first study the Pew Research Center conducted was a week-long survey at the end of April 2020 with around 10,000 U.S. adult participants. They asked the participants 4 questions regarding the news media's coverage: whether or not the news was getting the information they need, how accurate the news is, if the news was working to benefit the public, and if it was helping or hurting the country. The results were mostly positive. 59% of Americans believed that the news was getting them the information they need regarding the COVID outbreak, whereas only 24% believed it was not. 49% stated the news was largely accurate, and 24% stated that the news was largely inaccurate. 48% of Americans stated that they believed the news was working for the best interest of the public, whereas 36% believed it was self-interested. 46% of Americans believed the news was helping the country, and 34% said it was hurting. Although the results of the study regarding media news coverage in COVID were largely positive, the Pew Research Center also did a study in the same time frame regarding the American people's view on journalists. They asked the participants 2 questions: the level of confidence in journalists and whether journalists have ethical standards. 48% of U.S. adults stated that they have at least a fair amount of confidence in that journalists will act in the best interest of the public. Compared to the 2018 study, that is a 7% decrease of trust in journalists that might be attributed to the pandemic. 56% of American people also believe that journalists had low ethical standards, whereas 43% believe that they had high ethical standards.
I think there's a tendency to kind of cover the negative things, or media can sort of capitalize on fear. And so I feel like we do hear a lot of the horror stories of COVID, surely in the beginning, a lot of horror stories, right, of people who were affected. Families who are affected, and you know, the death count. But it would be nice to know about the situations where safety protocols have been put into place and allowed schools to continue to stay open, right? Or, you know, what universities have done well to keep their doors open and keep their students coming to class, right? I'd like to hear, as time goes on here, how the vaccines are making a big difference with being able to reopen and get back to normal or change our normal. And so I guess I would like to hear the positive stories, positive outcomes, and the ways in which we can continue to learn from the virus and live with the virus, because it seems as if it's not going away anytime soon. You might see the same news story covered by several outlets, and so you probably, if you do, you'll probably want to check those stories against each other. But it's well-known sources, you know, sources that are vetted, and so, you know, if you need medical information, right, you probably want to look at the Center for Disease Control website, and then you know you're getting that accurate information, right? But if you're seeing something on Fox News that's, you know, being sort of, it might come originally from the CDC, but now it's being manipulated or reused in some way that's telling a different kind of story or presenting a different kind of narrative than was intended by the CDC. I think you have to be leery of that sort of manipulation going on. And so I really do think that it's really important to look at multiple sources, and, you know, in order to trust what you're seeing, you've got to go back to the sort of original source and look at that for yourself.
COVID-19 misinformation has burned through social media and mainstream news like a wildfire. Misinformation during a pandemic can be very dangerous and can be harmful to people, both mentally and physically. Misinformation can originate from people trying to get attention to make a profit, or from those who do not have the appropriate knowledge or understanding of science or epidemiology. Politicians, including the former president, and celebrities have been associated with many false statements that are shared and spread by followers on social platforms by those who choose to believe their opinions over the facts provided by doctors and scientists. Early in the pandemic, President Trump repeatedly referred to COVID-19 as a hoax and said that it would eventually disappear. This became widely accepted and believed by Trump's followers and led many of them to disregard safety protocols, which was obviously dangerous to their health. We later learned that Trump had been given accurate scientific information that outlined the seriousness of the deadly realities of COVID-19, which he ignored.
Let's talk about an infodemic. That's basically the phenomenon of having so much information that it overwhelms people to the point where they don't know what to do with it anymore, right? They don't know how to process it. There's really just too much. It can create a situation where you can have a really good environment for people who are trying to get bad information out there, because when you have so much information out there and people don't really know how to evaluate it all, it becomes hard to tell what's true and what's false. It all just becomes information. So that's where, this sort of overwhelming amount of information can become problematic. And that's definitely something that we have going on in our society today. A lot of times people use the term misinformation as a sort of blanket term to cover every sort of wrong thing that's out there, but really there's a distinction. So misinformation is false information that someone is sharing unwittingly, not with bad intent, not with any malign intent. So that would be like your grandmother posting something on Facebook about how vaccines cause autism. She doesn't know any better. She may even be doing it out of a sincere desire to protect people by getting this information out there about that, but of course it's not correct information. Disinformation, on the other hand, is information that is created and distributed with harmful intent, with the intent to try to not only fool people or give people bad information, but even to destabilize reality. The best thing you can do, and I mean, it's unfortunate maybe that this is how things need to be, but you as a consumer of information really have to be the one who's responsible for determining the validity of information. And there are a few things that you can do to help yourself. The best thing is to cross-reference information, right? Don't rely on something that's coming just from a single source. Unfortunately, even good sources, people can spoof even good sources. So sometimes something even that may seem like it's from the government or from a reputable news source, it may not be. So it's really important to cross-reference information, find information from a number of credible sources before you really decide what it is that you're going to believe. And like I said, it's unfortunate that responsibility has been sort of thrust upon the consumer of information, but given that there is so much information out there, that really is the state that we're at. So information literacy is just increasingly important in our culture.
Unfortunately, media coverage of the pandemic is unbalanced and people are not sure what sources they can trust. As the Biomed Central study suggests, media coverage can impact mental health. Crisis communication can help mitigate any negative impacts, but it must be done correctly. Communication must be accurate and disseminated to the public in a timely manner. We must make and take our measures to eliminate disinformation and its spread, and we must make sure that when spreading the correct information, that it will be delivered in a way that will not negatively impact mental health.
Lourdes University students decided they had had enough with COVID and decided to speak out against its many flaws. Us college students have lost our willpower during COVID, making us feel depressed or possibly even lazy. It has made us speak out even stronger against racism and how COVID affects us, especially during classes. Thank you for listening to the story of our many struggles during COVID. I'm Nick.
And I'm Chelsea. Take care.